Jake Morrison was having a bad day, and it was about to get much worse. His old cargo ship called the Wanderer had been making strange noises for weeks, but he could not afford repairs. The hyperdrive was acting up again, and sparks flew from the control panel as he tried to jump to the next system. He needed this delivery job to pay for food and fuel, but nothing was going right. The ship shook hard as it dropped out of hyperspace in the wrong place. Jake looked at his screens and saw something that made his blood run cold. Two massive fleets of alien ships faced each other in the darkness of space. The ships were unlike anything humans had ever built. Some looked like giant crystals that caught starlight and threw it back in rainbow colors. Others looked alive with surfaces that moved like breathing skin. Jake had heard stories about the Great War between the crystal people called Zephyrians and the flesh ships of the Korthak, but seeing it was different. The fleets stretched for miles in every direction. Thousands of ships waited in perfect lines like soldiers ready for battle. His little cargo ship was floating right between them like a mouse between two angry elephants. The crystal ships were beautiful in a cold way. They had no sharp edges, but curved like frozen music. Light moved through their hulls in patterns that hurt to look at too long. Jake could see weapons that looked like growing flowers made of pure energy. The crews inside must see the universe, very differently than humans did. The flesh ships were different but just as impressive. Their hulls moved and changed shape as he watched. Weapons grew from their sides like thorns on a rose. Some ships had eyes that blinked and tracked movement. Others had mouths that opened to show rows of energy cannons. They were alive in ways that made Jake feel sick and amazed at the same time. Both fleets noticed his ship right away. Warning messages came through his radio in languages he did not understand. The computer tried to translate but could only catch a few words. The crystal people called him pest and vermin. The flesh ships sent pictures that showed his ship being crushed like a bug. Neither side seemed to think he mattered at all. Jake tried to call both fleets and explain that he was just lost. He told them he was human and did not want to fight anyone. The crystal people sent back a message that roughly meant go away, small thing, before we step on you. The flesh ships were even less polite, and sent images of what they would do to his ship if he did not leave. For a moment, Jake thought about running away. His ship was fast enough to escape before the battle started. He could jump to hyperspace and pretend this never happened, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the way both fleets treated him like dirt. Maybe it was seeing all those weapons pointed at each other. Maybe he was just too tired of running from everything. Jake opened his radio to broadcast on all channels that both fleets could hear. His voice was steady even though his hands shook as he spoke. He told them he was staying to watch what happened. Someone needed to be there to remember who they were before they chose to destroy everything. Someone needed to witness this madness and tell the galaxy what really happened here. The response was immediate. Both fleets sent angry messages telling him to leave or be destroyed. The crystal ships said he was too primitive to understand their war. The flesh ships sent pictures of his atoms being scattered across space. But Jake did not move. He turned on his ship's recording systems and prepared to document whatever came next. As the fleets moved into final attack positions, Jake broadcast again. He said he had seen enough wars in human space to know they all started the same way. People forgot why they were fighting and just kept fighting because that was all they knew how to do. He said both sides had beautiful ships and brave crews who deserved better than dying for reasons no one could remember. The crystal ships began to glow brighter as their weapons charged. The flesh ships started growing new weapons, and their hulls rippled with excitement. Jake sat in his small ship between two forces that could destroy planets and waited for the storm to begin. He did not know it yet, but his words were being recorded and sent throughout both empires. For the first time in centuries, someone was talking about their war not as glorious battle, but as tragedy that should never have started. Jake Morrison was just one human with an old cargo ship, but he had done something no general or diplomat had managed in 300 years. He had made both sides stop and think about what they were really doing. The battle began like the end of the world. Crystal ships fired beams of pure light that cut through space and turned metal into vapor. The flesh ships fought back with living missiles that changed shape as they flew and weapons that screamed, like dying animals. Jake had never seen anything so terrible and beautiful at the same time. His small ship shook as massive explosions lit up the darkness around him. Pieces of destroyed ships flew past his windows like deadly rain. The crystal ships sang as they died, and their music was sad enough to make him cry. The flesh ships made sounds like wounded beasts when their hulls were torn open and their crews spilled into space. Jake kept broadcasting everything he saw. He described each ship that died and tried to count the crews lost with each explosion. His voice stayed calm, but inside he felt sick watching so much death and destruction. He told both fleets about the beauty he saw in their ships, even as they tore each other apart. A crystal fighter spun past his ship with its hull cracked open like a broken egg. Jake could see the pilot inside still trying to work the controls, even though blue blood was floating around the cockpit. He broadcast a description of the pilot's courage and said the warrior deserved to be remembered as a hero. Similar things happened with the flesh ships, where crews kept fighting even when their ships were dying around them. Jake started giving names to the ships he watched die. He called one crystal ship the Star Singer because of the beautiful sounds it made. A flesh ship became the Heart of Steel because it kept fighting long after it should have been dead. He talked about each crew like they were people he knew instead of just numbers in a battle report. Both fleet commanders found themselves listening to Jake's broadcasts instead of focusing only on the battle. War Prime Crystal X had been fighting. For so long, he had forgotten that enemy ships had real people inside them. Flesh Admiral Gorvin was used to thinking about battle casualties as acceptable losses, but Jake made each death sound important and meaningful. The human talked about things the alien commanders had not thought about in years. He mentioned how the crystal ships looked like frozen music and wondered what kind of culture could build such beautiful things. He described the flesh ships as living art and said their creators must understand life in ways humans could barely imagine. Jake saw beauty where the aliens only saw weapons and enemies. When a damaged crystal fighter drifted toward a cluster of flesh ship missiles, Jake did something that changed everything. He flew his small cargo ship between the fighter and the missiles and used his weak tractor beam to pull the crystal pilot to safety. The gesture was militarily pointless, but it showed both fleets that someone cared more about saving life than winning battles. The crystal pilot Jake saved was named Harmonic 7, and she was amazed that an alien would risk his life for her. She had been taught that all non-crystal life was inferior and worthless, but this human had proved her wrong. She sent a short message to Jake thanking him and calling him friend in the crystal language. Jake's rescue was broadcast to both fleets and caused confusion in the ranks. Soldiers on both sides had to process the idea that someone would choose saving over killing when given the choice. Many crystal warriors started looking at flesh ships differently and wondering if their enemies might also be people worth saving. Flesh ship crews began to see crystal ships as something more than targets to be destroyed. The battle continued for hours with both sides taking heavy losses. Jake kept broadcasting and his voice became a strange constant in the chaos of war. He talked about the beauty of explosion patterns and the grace of ships moving in formation. He mentioned the courage of pilots who flew into certain death and the skill of gunners who could hit targets from impossible distances. As the fighting went on, Jake noticed something strange. Some ships from both sides started taking longer to fire at each other. A few crystal ships missed targets they should have hit easily. Some flesh ships seemed to hesitate before launching attacks. Jake's words about the value of enemy life were having an effect that no one expected. The battle finally ended when both fleets ran low on ammunition and energy. Neither side had won a clear victory, but both had lost thousands of ships and millions of lives. As the surviving vessels pulled back, Jake broadcast a final message about the waste of so much talent and courage. He said both sides had shown they were capable of incredible things, but had chosen to use their gifts for destruction instead of creation. War Prime Crystalex and Flesh Admiral Gorvin found themselves thinking about Jake's words long after the battle ended. Both commanders had been fighting this war for decades, but had never heard anyone describe it the way the human did. Jake saw their war not as a necessary conflict between good and evil, but as a tragedy that hurt everyone involved, including the winners. Word about the human who stayed spread through both empires like fire through dry grass. Jake Morrison became famous in ways he never wanted or expected. Crystal ships and flesh vessels started showing up wherever he went, not to fight him, but to talk with him. Soldiers from both sides wanted to meet the alien who had risked his life to save an enemy pilot during battle. Jake found himself invited to military meetings and diplomatic events by both empires. The Crystal people were fascinated by his ability to see meaning in chaos and destruction. The flesh ship crews were interested in his emotional responses, which they thought might be useful for understanding their enemies. Neither side trusted him completely, but both wanted to learn from him. The invitations were strange and uncomfortable at first. Crystal ship meeting rooms were made of living light that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Flesh ship conference. Areas were warm and damp like being inside a giant animal. But Jake learned to adapt and found ways to communicate with beings who thought in completely different ways than humans did. Jake decided to become an unofficial war reporter and started moving between battlefields in his cargo ship. He began conducting interviews with soldiers from both sides and broadcasting their stories across the galaxy. His questions were simple but powerful. He asked why they were fighting and what they hoped to achieve, and what they had lost in the war. The answers Jake got were surprising and sad. Most soldiers from both sides could not explain why the war had started or what winning would look like. They fought because their parents had fought and their children would fight after them. The war had become the normal state of things, and peace seemed like an impossible dream that only fools believed in. Jake interviewed a crystal warrior named Melody of Stars, who had been fighting for 50 years without seeing her home world. She could barely remember what her crystal gardens looked like, or how her family's harmonic songs sounded. The war had taken everything from her except the ability to kill enemies, and she was not sure that was enough to build a life around. Flesh ship engineer called Growing into Strength told Jake he had been rebuilt so many times that he no longer remembered his original form. Parts of his body came from dozens of different creatures, and his memories were mixed up with genetic programming from his modifications. He sometimes forgot whether his thoughts were his own or belonged to the alien DNA that kept him alive. The interviews revealed that soldiers on both sides were exhausted by endless conflict and dreamed of peace in private moments. But they were afraid to speak these thoughts out loud, because their own commanders might consider them traitors. Jake gave them a safe space to talk about their hopes and fears without judgment or political consequences. Through his broadcasts, Jake began building unexpected connections between enemies. Crystal warriors started recognizing flesh ship crews as individuals with names and stories instead of faceless targets. Flesh ship soldiers began seeing crystal people as beings with families and dreams rather than cold alien monsters. The enemy was becoming human in their eyes. Strange incidents started happening across the war zones. When a crystal medical ship was attacked by space pirates, a flesh ship patrol responded to Jake's emergency call and drove off the attackers. The rescue was officially covered up by both militaries, but word spread through the ranks that enemies had helped enemies for the first time in centuries. Scientists and artists from both empires began contributing to Jake's documentary project. A crystal composer shared music that had been banned during wartime because it was too beautiful and made soldiers think about home instead of fighting. A flesh ship poet read verses about growing gardens instead of weapons and dreaming of creation. Rather than destruction, Jake's broadcasts started including stories about life and love and hope instead of just tactics and casualties and territorial gains. People across both empires heard about crystal children learning to sing harmony with starlight and flesh ship families growing homes that matched their genetic memories. The galaxy remembered that there was more to existence than war. Both military commands became nervous about Jake's growing influence. Hardline generals from both sides viewed him as a threat to military discipline and operational security. Several attempts were made to silence him permanently, but each time soldiers from both empires risked their careers to protect the human who had given them hope for something better. Jake realized he was walking a dangerous line between peace and treason in the eyes of both empires. But he also saw that his work was having effects no diplomat or general had achieved in 3 centuries. Enemies were starting to see each other as people worth saving instead of problems to be solved with violence. That small change might be enough to build something larger and more lasting than any military victory. Jake's influence had grown too large for comfort, and both empires decided he needed to be stopped. Crystal Command sent assassins made of living light who could slip through any defense. Flesh ship leaders deployed hunters whose bodies had been modified specifically for killing difficult targets. Jake should have died a dozen times, but something unexpected kept happening. Soldiers from both sides kept saving him. Crystal warriors would warn him about incoming threats, and flesh ship crews would provide protection when assassins got too close. The troops who were supposed to be enemies worked together to keep Jake alive because he had become a symbol of hope for something better than endless war. The protection came from unlikely sources. Harmonic 7, the crystal pilot Jake had rescued during battle, became one of his most dedicated guards. A flesh ship captain named Blood and Iron, who had lost 3 ships in combat, started providing escort services with his remaining vessel. Former enemies found common ground in protecting the human who saw value in all life. Jake knew the assassination attempts meant he was getting close to something important. He started investigating the origins of the war using his unique access to both empires. Crystal archives and flesh ship genetic memories both contained pieces of the puzzle, but neither side had the complete picture of how their conflict began. The breakthrough came when Jake found the wreckage of an ancient research station that had been destroyed in the early days of the war. The station's computer systems were damaged, but still contained partial records from 300 years ago. Jake spent weeks rebuilding the data files and slowly uncovering the truth that both empires had forgotten or chosen to ignore. The war had started with a simple accident during first contact between the 2 species. A crystal diplomatic ship had broadcast on frequencies that interfered with a flesh ship mating ritual. The interference caused biological malfunctions that killed several flesh ship crew members, but the deaths were not intentional, and the crystal people immediately offered help and compensation. Both sides had initially worked together to prevent the incident from causing larger problems. Crystal scientists helped flesh ship doctors understand the interference patterns. Flesh ship engineers taught crystal people about biological communication systems. For a brief time, the 2 species had been allies and friends working toward mutual understanding, but extremist groups on both sides used the deaths as justification for military action. Crystal hardliners claimed the flesh ships were too dangerous to exist in civilized space. Flesh ship militants declared that crystal people were cold killers who could not be trusted. Fear and prejudice overcame reason and cooperation. The limited military actions escalated when both sides misunderstood defensive preparations as aggressive buildup. Crystal fleets moved to protect their colonies, and flesh ships interpreted the movement as preparation for invasion. Flesh ship patrols increased security around their space, and crystal commanders saw the patrols as evidence of planned attacks. Within 10 years, the original accident was forgotten and replaced by fresh grievances and new reasons for hatred. Each battle created more widows and orphans who demanded revenge. Each destroyed ship became justification for building more weapons. The war took on a life of its own and consumed everything both civilizations had once valued about themselves. Jake broadcast his discovery across both empires, and the revelation hit like an earthquake. Countless trillions had died in a war that began with an accident and continued through misunderstanding. The heroic narratives that sustained the conflict for centuries crumbled when people learned the truth about their glorious struggle. The response was immediate and chaotic. Peace demonstrations erupted on worlds throughout both empires as civilians demanded an end to the senseless killing. Military units began laying down their weapons and refusing orders to continue fighting. Some bases declared themselves neutral zones where Crystal people and Flesh ship crews could meet safely. War Prime Crystal X and Flesh Admiral Gorvin found themselves in impossible positions. They had built their entire lives around the war, but could no longer justify its continuation to their own people. Both leaders had lost friends and family to the conflict, and learning it was all based on lies and mistakes made their sacrifice feel meaningless. Hardline factions on both sides attempted military coups to keep the war going. Crystal purists tried to overthrow Crystal X for being weak, and Flesh ship militants moved against Gorvin for considering peace with the enemy. But the attempted coups failed when soldiers refused to fight their own people to preserve a war they no longer believed in. In a moment that surprised everyone, including themselves, both commanders made simultaneous contact with Jake Morrison. They requested his help with something neither empire had attempted in 3 centuries of conflict. They wanted to talk with each other and see if there was any way to end the madness that had consumed their peoples for so long. The peace talks happened aboard Jake's cargo ship because it was the only vessel in the galaxy that both sides trusted. The Wanderer had become a symbol of neutrality and hope, floating in the darkness between 2 empires that had forgotten how to speak to each other without shooting. Jake felt the weight of history as he prepared his ship for the most important meeting in 3 centuries. War Prime Crystal X arrived first in a small crystal scout ship that sang with harmonious frequencies. The crystal leader was taller than Jake expected, with skin that looked like living diamond and eyes that held the light of distant stars. Crystal X moved with the grace of someone who had spent decades in zero gravity but carried the weariness of endless responsibility. Flesh Admiral Gorvin came in a bioship that pulsed with organic rhythms and seemed to breathe as it docked with Jake's vessel. The Flesh ship commander was shorter than most of his species, with skin that showed the scars of multiple rebuildings. Parts of his body were clearly artificial, but integrated so well that the boundaries between original and modification were impossible to see. The first meeting nearly ended in disaster when both leaders instinctively reached for weapons that were not there. 3 centuries of conditioning made them see each other as mortal enemies, even when they intellectually knew they were there to make peace. Jake had to physically step between them and remind them why they had come. Communication was difficult, because Crystal people and Flesh ship crews thought in completely different ways. Crystal X spoke in harmonics and mathematical relationships that barely translated into words. Gorvin used biological metaphors and genetic concepts that made no sense to Crystal thinking. Jake found himself serving as translator for ideas as well as language. The breakthrough came when Jake asked both leaders to describe their homeworlds before the war started. Crystal X spoke about crystal gardens that grew in harmony with stellar radiation and created living symphonies of light and sound. Zephyrian artists had shaped entire continents into musical instruments that played songs for the stars. Gorvin described biocities that had been grown rather than built, where Flesh ship families lived in homes that matched their genetic memories. Korthak architects had created living buildings that adapted to their inhabitants and grew more beautiful with each generation. The cities had been works of art that changed and evolved like music made visible. Both leaders realized they were describing similar dreams about cultures focused on creation and beauty and harmony. The war had not just consumed ships and lives, but had transformed both civilizations into shadows of what they once were. Their greatest artists now designed weapons instead of beauty. Their most brilliant scientists developed new ways to kill. Instead of ways to grow and build, Jake proposed something that seemed impossible to both commanders. Instead of trying to return to what they had lost, both empires should work together to create something new and better. The combined knowledge of crystal technology and flesh ship bioengineering could solve problems that neither side could handle alone. The idea was met with skepticism at first, but Jake had prepared specific proposals. Joint research stations could study cosmic phenomena that required both crystal precision and biological adaptation. Combined colonies could terraform dead worlds using techniques that neither species possessed alone. Cultural exchanges could rebuild the arts and sciences that war had destroyed. Crystalex and Gorvin spent days arguing about details and fighting about old grievances that seemed impossible to overcome. Both leaders carried personal losses from the war that made forgiveness seem like betrayal of the dead. But Jake kept bringing them back to the central question of what kind of future they wanted to build for their children. The negotiations were interrupted several times by extremist attacks from both sides. Crystal purists tried to destroy Jake's ship with Crystalex aboard, and flesh ship militants attempted to assassinate Gorvin for negotiating with the enemy. Each attack was stopped by combined forces of crystal and flesh ship moderates who had decided peace was worth fighting for. Jake realized the talks were as much about healing emotional wounds as solving political problems. Both leaders needed to process centuries of hatred and loss before they could imagine working together. He helped them understand that making peace did not mean forgetting the dead, but honoring them by building something worthy of their sacrifice. Underpants. Final breakthrough came when a young crystal officer and a flesh ship engineer who had been part of the security teams started working together to improve the ship's systems. Their collaboration was small and practical, but it showed both commanders that their people could work together when they focused on solving problems instead of fighting about the past. After 2 weeks of talks, Crystalex and Gorvin reached an agreement in principle to end the war and begin cooperation between their empires. The details would take months to work out, but the fundamental decision was made. Jake Morrison, the human cargo pilot, had helped 2 ancient enemies take the first steps toward becoming partners in building a better galaxy. The formal peace treaty was signed 6 months after Jake first stumbled into the war zone, and everything changed. The ceremony took place on a neutral space station built specifically for the occasion, using both crystal and flesh ship technology. The document itself was a work of art inscribed on bio-parchment that sang with crystal harmonics when touched by light. Jake Morrison stood between the 2 leaders as they signed the treaty that ended 3 centuries of destruction. War Prime. Crystalex used a stylus made of living crystal that left traces of starlight on the page. Flesh Admiral Gorvin signed with bio-ink that contained genetic markers from both species and would grow more beautiful over time. The signing ceremony was broadcast across both empires and watched by trillions of beings who had never imagined they would see this day. Children who had grown up knowing only war saw their leaders choosing peace. Veterans who had lost everything in battle watched former enemies shake hands and promise to work together. Jake was given an honor that neither empire had ever granted to an outsider. Both Crystalex and Gorvin declared him a dual citizen of their civilizations and named him the first ambassador of shared worlds. His job would be to oversee the implementation of peace and help develop joint projects between the former enemies. The bold transformation was not easy or immediate. Centuries of hatred could not be erased with a signature, and there were many problems and setbacks. Some extremist groups on both sides continued fighting because they viewed peace as betrayal of everything they had believed in. Several terrorist attacks targeted joint facilities and mixed crews, but the momentum had shifted toward cooperation instead of destruction. For every act of violence, there were dozens of acts of friendship and partnership. Crystal scientists worked with flesh ship engineers to solve problems neither could handle alone. Artists from both cultures began creating new forms of beauty that combined crystal precision with biological creativity. The first joint colony was established on a dead world in the former war zone. Crystal architects and flesh ship bioengineers worked together to design cities that were both functional and beautiful. The buildings grew from crystal foundations but had living walls that adapted to their inhabitants and created unique environments for each family. Jake continued his documentary work, but now he recorded stories of peace instead of war. He interviewed scientists who were making discoveries that amazed both species. He talked with artists who were creating new forms of music and sculpture that neither culture could have imagined alone. He filmed children from both empires playing games that their parents never could have played together. The first combined research station began studying the galactic core using instruments that required both crystal focusing technology and flesh ship biological sensors. The discoveries they made in the first month answered questions that had puzzled both civilizations for thousands of years. Working together, they could see deeper into space and time than either could manage alone. Jake's broadcasts inspired other species throughout the galaxy to reconsider their own conflicts and prejudices. Trade wars ended when merchants realized cooperation was more profitable than competition. Border disputes were resolved when neighboring systems chose to work together instead of fighting over resources. The story of the human who walked into a war and changed everything became legend throughout the galaxy. Children learned about Jake Morrison in schools, and adults told stories about him in bars and meeting places. But Jake himself remained modest and insisted he had not ended the war by himself. He always said one person cannot stop a war, but they can remind others that war is a choice, and if war is a choice, then peace is also a choice. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to stand between enemies and say, there has to be a better way. The real heroes were the people on both sides who chose to listen and risk everything for the chance of something better. Jake stood on the observation deck of Harmony Station and watched crystal ships and flesh vessels working together to build a massive telescope array. The project would let them see farther into space than any civilization had ever managed. Through the transparent windows, he could see beings who had been enemies for centuries now planning expeditions to distant galaxies. His final broadcast was simple but said everything that mattered. Two ancient enemies had become partners in discovery, and tomorrow they might reach the stars together. The war that consumed the galaxy for 3 centuries had ended not with explosions, but with the quiet sound of former enemies learning to trust each other. In the distance, a human cargo ship approached, carrying the first civilian families who would make their homes in this new world of peace. Jake smiled as he watched the ship dock, knowing that his accidental journey into war had helped create something worth building a future around. Sometimes the best victories came from refusing to fight at all.